Good morning and welcome to News Conference Extra, a special segment of Today in LA Weekend. I'm Conan Nolan. Emily Cadei is with the Sacramento Bee. She's the Washington correspondent and recently just had an article about Joe Biden, who's now in the race for president, and whether or not he has an organization here in California. Emily, thanks for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
So let's talk about Joe Biden. Everybody's focused on Iowa, New Hampshire, as well as South Carolina. The California primary is in March of next year. Early voting starts the day after the Iowa caucus. So every candidate has to have, it seems to me, some kind of organization. What have you heard about Joe Biden in lining up support in this state?
He's just starting that process, is my understanding. There's a lot of folks, obviously, that he has relationships with in California, but there's also a lot of competition for a lot of the influencers, the donors in the state, particularly because Senator Kamala Harris, who is a native daughter of California, is already in the race. And so it's going to be, there's going to be a lot of people vying for the same pot of donors and supporters, and Biden's late entry doesn't serve him as an advantage in that capacity.
In terms of the Democratic Party leadership in the state, how is he faring and what friends does he have?
Well, his best friend, his most prominent friend at this point, is Senator Dianne Feinstein. She's served in the Senate with him for a number of years and served on the Senate Judiciary Committee with him. And she came out even before he announced, months before he announced, and said she would support him if he ran. So she's sort of the big fish for him at this point. We haven't heard too much else from others. I think a lot of both donors and also members of Congress and others are still weighing their options, I would say, while Harris, for her part, has really swept up most of the statewide elected officials and even a handful of members of Congress.
Such as Gavin Newsom, who, of course, they had the same political consultant, and A. Smith. Who else?
She has the state treasurer, the secretary of state, the lieutenant governor, a number of Southern California Congress members, including newly elected Representative Katie Hill from Los Angeles, Ted Lieu, who's very prolific on Twitter, so he's known in that capacity. She's certainly made a concerted effort to really pick up a lot of those endorsements early on and kind of establish that California is her home base. But it's a big state and there's a lot of people there, so it's not like the candidates are just going to stop campaigning just because Harris is from the state of California.
True. The Quinnipiac University poll from earlier this month has him with I believe it's an 8-point lead, 26 points over Bernie Sanders at 18, Kamala Harris at 17. And now that poll was taken before Pete Buttigieg, the mayor of South Bend, started catching fire. Give us a sense, based on your research, as to how much candidate shopping is taking place out of Silicon Valley and out of Hollywood, which finances so much of the Democratic Party.
There's a lot of candidate shopping going on. The consultants and fundraisers I've spoken to say it's sort of like every night there's a different dinner party or luncheon. I know that Pete Buttigieg, the mayor of South Bend, Indiana, is sort of the flavor of the month right now, is heading to the Los Angeles area for a series of fundraisers, and there were reports that he was actually being fought over in terms of who would get to host events for him. I mentioned in my article that Jeffrey Katzenberg, who hosted a fundraiser for Biden and his political action committee last fall, was fighting to be one of the people to host a fundraiser for Pete Buttigieg. So there's a lot of these influential donor types that are giving to multiple candidates, that are hosting events for multiple candidates. People who have even endorsed one candidate hosting events for another candidate, like Susie Tompkins Buell, who's a big San Francisco-based donor and fundraiser. So you're just seeing a lot of people sort of hedging their bets at this point because, as you noted, there's just so many candidates in the field, and people still don't know quite how it's all going to shake out.
Is there a sense that Beto O'Rourke, who was in town yesterday, has lost some of his standing because of Pete Buttigieg, that he's sort of eclipsed him?
I think it's hard to know exactly who's pulling from who. It's such a fragmented race right now, in the sense that Buttigieg is also trying to appeal to some of these working class, Midwest, blue collar type voters. I do think that could pull from Biden because that's clearly his strategy. He has a lot of support from traditional labor unions and backers of organized labor. So there is a little bit of that. But I also think, Biden's been around the Democratic Democratic Party for a long time, and so he's vying for that same class of donors and elected officials and influencers that folks like Senator Harris and Senator Booker and even Beto O'Rourke are vying for. I think Bernie sort of has his own separate activist base that's a little bit different from that universe, but certainly there's a lot of people all sort of jostling for the same kind of surrogates or institutional support, if you will.
It's going to be very interesting over the next several weeks. Of course, there's the debate in Miami. Emily Cadei from the Sacramento Bee out of Washington, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much.
On NBC4's news conference at 9 o'clock, we'll be talking with the Speaker of the California State Assembly, Anthony Rendon, about a number of issues, including the measles outbreak, a bill in the legislature over vaccinations, as well as the housing bill, and whether or not, for example, they should lower the voting age to 17. Plus, a report out from UCLA indicates more than half of LA County residents have considered or know someone close to them who's considered leaving the state. We talk with Zev Yaroslavsky, former LA County supervisor. That's news conference at 9 following Meet the Press. We'll see you then.